For example, you take a bank. Suppose it contains a function called deposit, which adds money into the bank account. So in this case, the current account balance should be bundled along with the deposit function and should not be accessible outside the function. So whenever you bind or bundle a function along with corresponding data, then it is called as a closure. So as per the definition, a closure is a function that is bundled together along with corresponding data that it wants to manipulate. So the underlying goal of the closure is the data must be made private to the same function. It should not be accessible to outside the function. But sometimes in the real-world applications, you might be having more than one function that manipulates or shares same amount of data. For example, in the bank example, let's say we have one function for deposit and another function for withdraw. So in this case, both function wants to share the same data, that is current account balance. So outside of these two functions, the data, that is current account balance, should not be accessible. Means to those set of functions only the data should be made as a private and should not be accessible outside of those functions. That is only possible by using closure in JavaScript. In order to implement closure, suppose we have a function. So inside this function, let's try to create some variables, or you may create some functions. By default, this variable or function that is created inside the function are accessible inside the same function only and cannot be accessible outside the function. And this function must return an object that contains a set of functions, and this object is called as a public object which contains the data or functions that can be accessible outside the closure. So this function is the closure. These are the private variables or functions that must be accessible inside the closure only, and this object is the public object which we are going to return from the closure, and this can contain the properties or methods that can be accessible outside the closure. And based on this scenario, the developer must decide which are the private and which are the public. For example, there is a function or data variable that should be hidden and should not be accessible outside the closure, means it should be made as a private. So you will declare them with var keyword. In case of function, you will declare with function keyword. So those are by default private variables or private functions which are accessible inside the same closure only. But the data or methods that must be accessible outside the closure should be mentioned in this object, because we are trying to return this object reference so that any code that is present outside the closure can access the properties and methods of this object. So by definition, closure is a function that can contain the private variables or private functions that cannot be accessible outside the closure. And either the closure can return a function or can return an object. For example, there is only one public function that should be accessible outside the closure, then the closure can directly return that public function. But in case of multiple public functions, it can return an object that contains those public functions. Let us try to implement these closures practically. First, let me create a simple closure in this lecture, but we will make it complex in the next lecture. Let's create closure.js. For example, there is a function called deposit, and it wants to have a private variable called current balance. so that the current balance of the bank account should not be accessible outside the deposit function, but it must be accessible only inside the same function. So let's create a function here. You can either create this function with function keyword like this, or you can also store this function reference in a variable. Both are equivalent, there is no difference. So, for example, above, there is a variable called current balance which stores the current bank account balance. For example, as of now, the balance is 1000, and the customer will invoke this deposit function and supply the amount to be deposited. So we are receiving that amount into this variable called deposit amount. So we have to add this deposit amount into the current balance. So we can simply say current balance equal to current balance plus deposit amount. So we can invoke that deposit, and for example, I would like to deposit 200. And after adding the deposit amount into the current balance, let's print a string. That is, current account balance is so-and-so balance. So it prints the value of the current balance variable. Oops, we have to receive this returned value and print using console.log statement, right? So let us run this. So as of now, by default, current balance equal to 1000. And we have a function, but we are not invoking that function immediately. And in this place, we are invoking that deposit function and supplying the amount, that is 200. So deposit amount equal to 200 here. And we will add that 200 into the current balance. So current balance will be updated as 1200 internally in the memory. And it will return the string value, that is account balance is 1200. So that value will be printed by console.log statement. So we are getting the same as output. But the problem here is that this variable, that is current balance, is directly accessible anywhere in the entire file. So there is no security surrounding it. Means there is no any element that surrounds this variable as well as this function, and that is exactly the closure. So I would like to keep this function and variable inside a closure so that this will become as a scope, and the variables that are created in the closure are accessible only within the same functions but not outside. That is the goal of closure. So in JavaScript, how do you create a scope? You can create it by using functions, right? So let us create an outer function with any name, for example, bank account deposit. You can create with simply like this, or you can also write like where bank account deposit equal to function. Either of the way it works. So in this case, I would like to return the deposit function. And here, I would like to first invoke that bank account deposit function. So from this statement, first we are invoking this bank account deposit function. So it reaches here. Of course, it declares the variable like this. And we have a function called deposit. And that function reference will be returned from this statement so that we can receive into a variable here. And using that variable, we have to invoke that function here. Let's say, for example, I would like to create a variable here. Let's say dp. And invoke that deposit function through this variable called dp. Now also, you will get the same output exactly. But how does it work internally? In the last lecture, we have understood about environment object, right? Let's try to think in that way. So for the entire program, there is a global scope, that is global environment object. By default, it contains a property that is outer equal to null. So from this statement exactly, we are invoking that bank account deposit function. So it reaches here. Whenever the function execution starts, automatically for that, a lexical environment object will be created. So this is the environment object of bank account deposit function. And in this object, we have declared a variable called current balance. So current balance equal to 1000. And we have another function called a deposit that will be stored here. Alright, at the end of the function, we are trying to return that deposit function reference. So functions are reference types, which means that when you return a function, that function reference will be returned back to the calling portion. So the reference of the deposit function will be returned back into the receiving portion, that is the variable called dp here. So in the global environment object, we have a variable called dp that contains a reference to deposit function that is present in this object. But here the exact point is that the global environment object cannot access this variable called current balance because it was stored in the environment object of bank account deposit function, so cannot be accessible from the outer. See, the rule here is that the inner object can access the properties of outer object, but the global environment object cannot access the properties of inner environment object. So in this case, based on that rule, we are unable to access the current balance from global environment, but only we can access the deposit function. That is the exact logic behind the closure. So how it is a closure here? Or how this current balance become as private? It's because we are trying to return a function reference here, so only that function is accessible from outer code. But the variables or functions that are not returned from this bank account deposit function cannot be accessible from outside the code. In that way, they become as private. So it is just like, whatever the variables or functions that you return to me, only those can be accessed by me. But the variables or functions that are not returned by you cannot be accessible by me. This is a basic logic of closure. In other words, whichever the functions or variables that you want to give access to outside the code, you can return them as an object or directly. And in the same way, whichever the variables that must be kept private or secret, that should not be returned from this function. That is how the closure works. For example, here we are trying to access that current balance variable. We cannot access that. It's because it was the local to the particular function and not returned from that function. See, as you can see, we can access that deposit function here. So it becomes 1200 as expected. But we cannot access that current balance variable directly from the outer code. But anytime you can access the current balance by using that deposit function. Let's say I would like to deposit another 150. So we are expecting 1350 here. And we are getting the same here. So the current balance value is stored there in memory, but still not accessible directly. That is the goal of the closure. So this is the simple and basic example of closures. But sometimes there can be multiple functions that wants to access the same data. For example, there must be two functions like deposit and withdraw. Both wants to share the same data. Let us see how to solve it in the next lecture.